Thank you, Patricia. Good morning, everyone. I guess age comes before beauty, so I'm beginning because I'm actually going to talk about the past.
Beauty.
I just want to say that 50 years ago, a conference like this could never have taken place in this country, and perhaps not any place in the world. So I want to talk a little bit about 50 years ago, about where we were then, crossing cultural borders for myself, and being the other. 50 years ago, 1954, when I was a sophomore in college and majoring in journalism because I wanted to be a writer. There wasn't such thing as creative writing majors in the school that I went to. There wasn't even a class. I was told by my advisor I should change my major since I'd never get a job as a journalist because one, I was Asian, and two, a woman. Now, can you imagine a professor telling that to a woman student today? This is 50 years ago, I was told that, and I accepted his advice without question, changed from journalism to social welfare, and forgot my dream of ever becoming the first Asian Brenda Starr. But that was the 50s, a time when proving your Americanness meant denying your racial, ethnic, and cultural differences by assimilating into a melting pot. In those days, real Americans were individuals of Anglo-European heritage. Then in the 60s, as I mentioned in my talk, led by the Black Power movement, attitudes began to change, not only by the dominant white majority, but also by ethnic and cultural minorities themselves. African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and American Indians began rediscovering their own heritages and voicing their ethnic and racial worth. In the 70s and 80s, after the Vietnam War, there was a tremendous upsurge of immigration from all parts of the world. And with this new infusion of vitality came fascinating and exotic lifestyles, food, religious practices, art, music, and literature. But unlike the earlier periods, when minorities sought acceptance by assimilation, the mosaic concept replaced the melting pot. Cultural minorities were encouraged to preserve their traditions and language, and today in literature, we are enjoying the fruits of this changed attitude with the explosion of publications by and about ethnic and cultural minorities in this country, as well as in other foreign lands. So within the last half century, I have experienced tremendous changes in attitudes toward cultural, racial, and gender differences, which is not to say we have come to a perfect state. Far from it. Racial hatred is still with us, and the winds of ethnic cleansing still blow across the oceans to infect our consciousness. But I will say, in my lifetime, it is better now than it was in the 50s. I would like now to say a few words about crossing cultural borders in my writing. Because so much of what I write, even fiction, comes out of my experiences, I feel I have to talk a bit about my personal life. And as I look back, I can see 3 or 4 emblematic cultural borders I had to cross. First was before World War II. Both of my parents spoke English as well as Japanese, but my grandmother, who was my mother's mother, spoke only Japanese. Our food was basically Japanese. We observed Japanese traditions and rituals, such as New Year's and the Dance of the Dead, Obon. My oldest sisters and brothers had arranged marriages. So inside the home, our culture was basically a Japanese one. But once we stepped outside our doors, we crossed a border into another culture. For example, My father loved to dance. We lived in Ocean Park, California, where there was a popular dance hall called the Aragon Ballroom. Every Saturday night, the whole family would go to the Aragon, where Mama and Papa and my sisters and brothers foxtrotted to big-name bands like Paul Whitman and Tommy Dorsey, who was not yet famous, but who came regularly to play at the neighborhood dance hall. I didn't realize it then, but we were crossing a cultural line where the whole family took on a completely different persona. At the Aragon, we jitterbugged, we waltzed, and we hummed along with the bands, and we were boisterous. My father was a favorite partner for the many Jewish, Italian, and Portuguese widows who were among the regulars. We were part of mainstream America. But at home, in the house, the borders closed, and we assumed a quiet and subdued character, a Japanese, otonashi sensibility. Then in 1942, when our family was interned at Manzanar, I crossed another cultural border into a forest habitat where everyone looked like me. Camp was, in a way, a safety zone, because socially, we didn't have to deal with the other. For the first time in my life, I was in a racial majority, no longer in a minority or an outsider. Odd as it may sound, living in an internment camp for individuals of my own race was indeed for me a powerful, emblematic border crossing. For the first time, I began identifying with Japanese culture outside the world of my family, for in Ocean Park, we were the only Japanese American family living in the neighborhood. Leaving Manzanar to return to mainstream America after the war was a third great crossing, and needless to say, it was greatly traumatic returning to a society that blamed us for the war, that hated us enough to imprison us behind barbed wire. Like many other Japanese Americans of my generation, burdened by this false guilt, I sought to assimilate into the dominant culture and become as American as apple pie, diffusing any perception I was anything but a loyal American. Marriage was the fourth cultural border crossing. I married a man whose culture was about as opposite to mine as one could even make up. White, born in San Francisco of Texan and Oklahoman immigrants to California, a Bible Belt Protestant who never had eaten garlic or Chinese food before he met me. Jim also entered a dizzying world of strange tastes, smells, and views. I, at least, had studied American culture closely, desiring admission past its closed doors. But Jim's initiation, crossing over to my world, must have been astonishing. And I might add that when Jim and I dated at San Jose State University in the early 50s, we were the only interracial couple on the campus, and that was among 10,000 students. As a writer, I find my own personal border crossings a source of rich material, as well as a training ground for viewing experience and life through a kaleidoscope lens, seeing the complexities and vibrant colors of lives being tested, challenged, or threatened as cultures meet, or collide, or overlap, or merge. And this is the stuff of great stories, especially today, as information, travel, war, political and economic instability cause national borders to change and disappear. And soon, the other becomes you. Thank you. I'd like to comment on Barty's, what Barty was just talking about. I wish that I could have evolved to that point that I could write and not be aware of what, how, if I'm quote, educating the audience or telling them something about Japanese American culture. And it took me a long time to even get to the point where I could finish this novel my first novel. It took me dozens of years. And one of the reasons why I couldn't finish it, I mean, I had this idea that I wanted to write about the picture bride. And I went to Japan and I interviewed in the States. And I began to write. I would write about this picture bride and her story. And I found that after 400 to 500 pages, I was still stuck in 1910. I could not get past the early part. It was easy to write about that life, the early immigrant life. But I found that I did not want to get near the Second World War because I wanted the story to begin at the turn of the century and then to end with the bombing of Hiroshima. But I could not get into the Second World War because I knew that I would have to fictionalize the internment. So the internment being the landmark event that it is in Japanese American history, I felt that it might be irreverent, that it might be disrespectful to make up a story about the internment. And this book, I'm the first internee, surviving internee that has fictionalized that event. And so I had a feeling of responsibility to the community that I had to tell the story correctly, truthfully, but yet how could I give it life in a fictional way? And so I come from a very different background place because I still feel that I'm a beginner. So those of you who are starting writing, and after 50s, 60s, don't give up hope. I did my first novel. She's talking about identity crisis, right? I'd like to address that, since I certainly went through it. But I'd like to get back to language, and in terms of writing, that, a new voice, for a voice in literature, especially with, quote, hyphenated Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, etc., that the most interesting voices are those that are very different and that are not your specific English, pure English writing, yeah? So what happens very often with young immigrants or second-generation immigrants who have accent or who think in their heads maybe like their parents, etc., they lose it. They try to lose that because they want to speak really good English. And when they want to write and they want to speak good English, and so what happens is they lose that kind of individuality. This is for writing. I'm talking about writing. And I know that this happened in my case. I wanted to be really, just to be able to capture everything in perfect English. And so that when I write, it's very hard for me to try to get my own voice that is Japanese. Because I think, I'm too yin. I'm too submissive in my writing. I have to be yang, and I have to fight, and I have to be aggressive with my writing. But Japanese sensibility is very understated in writing. And so I think that in terms of your identity of who you are, it's not out there. It's in here. It's who you are in here. And if you happen to be a nectarine, the nectarine doctrine that I have is one of, a nectarine is a cross between a peach and a pear. So what comes out is a nectarine. It's a wonderful fruit. It's very different and it's very unique, but it's a different combination of the two. So I always have thought of myself, finally, as a nectarine, that you can't distinguish what is Japanese in me and what is, quote, American. And so you may have to go through that process of your own identification, of who you are. It doesn't have to fit. That's one thing in America. It doesn't have to fit any special mold. It's who you are from inside, not what they think of you out there, and that you do what you want. But in the interim, don't lose the language or what culture from China. Don't give it up. Mix it in.